Welcome back everyone. Today we're going to be making a 6-panel triangle cap. I'll be walking you through the steps so you can make this entire hat at home and also giving you tips on how to ramp up your production. And if you are new to sewing, you should have no problem finding the easy step-by-step tutorial. With all that being said, don't forget to grab the PDF pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you need a 1/4 yard for your main fabric, and I recommend using a canvas, denim, or twill. These are all very durable fabrics and they're easy to work with. I'm going to be using a very lightweight twill. These can be kind of hard to find, so if you do come across one, I highly recommend it. But like always, get creative, test different fabrics, and find something that's really going to bring your design together. For the rest of the supplies needed to make the cap, these are going to be called the cap components, and this includes all the hardware on the cap. And all of these supplies are available at capsupplyco.com. You can buy them in kits to make an entire cap, or you can buy them individually. The first thing you'll need is a back closure, and these come in all different styles. You can get leather ones, plastic ones, nylon ones. They all do the same thing, so it really comes down to what style you like. Next, you'll need a sweatband. You can actually make these, but I prefer to buy them because the ones you buy are millinery grade, and it really makes for a nice finished hat. But we'll get more into this once we install the sweatband. You'll need one brim, and you can make yours out of plastic or cardboard. The pattern includes the brim panel, so you can trace it out on any material and cut it out. I'm actually going to be using one that I bought. I actually like these a lot more than making my own. Again, it makes for a better finish, and you can also get these in different shapes and sizes. So it's really fun to play around with. And I actually made one out of a regular size brim and a smaller brim just to show you the difference. You'll need 6 eyelets, and these are going to be used for the vents on the top of the cap. These are optional. If you want to sew these on, you can do that too. You'll need a 1/4 yard of cord, and this is optional. We're going to be using it up front. It's going to rest on the brim in between the brim and the crown. It's just an extra look. You don't need to add it if you don't like it. You'll need a 1/4 yard of interfacing. This is going to be used on the front 2 panels. It's going to give structure to your fabric so that front section stands up nice. This is optional. If you don't like that look, you can make it without the interfacing. And lastly, you'll need your pattern. This pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super easy to use. All you have to do is download it, print it off, cut it out, and you're ready to go. And after you print it out, before you cut out the panels, double check at the top of the page. There's going to be a size scale there. Just give that a measure to make sure it was printed off correctly. Sometimes your printer will automatically adjust the scale, and this is just a safeguard so you print it out correctly. And once you have all your supplies gathered and your pattern printed out, it's time to move into cutting. And after printing out your pattern, double check to make sure it's printed to the correct size, and then we're going to cut on the outside of the black line. Once you cut out all of the fabric, you should end up with one bottom front panel cut out of your main fabric. Going along with this panel, you also need one interfacing panel. This is optional. It's going to add stiffness to the front crown. If you don't like this look, you don't need to cut this panel. But if you do choose to add the stiffness, you're not actually going to cut the interfacing to the shape of the pattern. You're going to cut it bigger, and then we're going to fuse the layers together and trim it out after. You'll need one top front panel cut out of your main fabric. The same goes for this panel. If you choose to add the interfacing, you're also going to need interfacing for this panel. And again, you want to cut it bigger than the shape of the pattern. You'll need 2 side panels cut out of your main fabric, and you'll need 2 back panels cut out of your main fabric. Lastly, you'll need 3 brim panels, 2 cut out of your main fabric and 1 cut out of your cardboard or plastic. When it comes to the actual brim panel insert, you can make this or you can buy it online. Just like with the interfacing, we don't want to cut the fabric panels to the shape of the brim. We want to cut them bigger because we're going to be tracing the brim onto the fabric. This is going to make it easier to sew and also more accurate when we're sliding the brim into the sleeve. But we'll get more into this once we start assembling the brim. Moving on to assembly, the first thing we're going to do is grab the bottom and top front panels. This step we're going to be adding the interfacing. If you're choosing not to add the interfacing, you can skip ahead. And I'm using a heavyweight interfacing with an adhesive back. And you can find this style of interfacing at most fabric stores. Since this is an adhesive interfacing, we're going to place the wrong side of the fabric to the adhesive side of the interfacing. To fuse these layers together, I'm going to be using a heat press. The heat press I'm using is a larger format, and it's great for ramping up your production. To do this, you just cut a larger piece of interfacing and place multiple front panels on that interfacing. With the larger format, you can press them all at once and have multiple front panels ready. After pressing, let the interfacing cool for a couple minutes so that adhesive dries. At this point, you can trim around the panels to remove the excess interfacing. At the moment, I'm only going to trim the interfacing off the top panel. This is because I want to place a logo on the bottom panel, and I'm going to use that interfacing to place inside my hoop. This is another optional step, but it's a great time to add embroidery if you have a machine. It's a lot easier to add the embroidery on a flat surface rather than a finished hat at the end. Now that we have the logo on, we can trim around the outside edge to remove the interfacing. If you are wondering, I didn't use stabilizer on the back when I added the embroidery. This is because the interfacing I'm using is stiff enough, so I didn't need it. Moving on to the next step, we're going to grab both the back panels, both the side panels, and just the top front panel. Using the pattern, locate the eyelet placement guide on each of the panels. Poke a hole directly in the circle, line it up with the fabric, and mark it with chalk. When it comes to the top panel, it is optional. You don't need to add eyelets to this panel, but we're going to do it for the video. And to make sure the eyelets are placed correctly, line up the outside edges of each panel. I'll be using a 7mm eyelet. You can get these in a kit with a bunch of different finishes and everything you need to install them. This kit comes with the hole punch, so I'm going to punch out a hole directly on my eyelet placement guides. Feed the top of the eyelet through the opening from the right side of the fabric. Flip the panel around to the wrong side and add the back. To install them, I'll be using a hammer dive. Feel free to use a press or pliers. Slide the base through the eyelet from the right side, place the post into the base, and hammer it down. And when it comes to eyelets, you don't need a lot of force or else you're going to bend the eyelet. Then go ahead and repeat this step for the rest of the panels. If you are using a lighter weight fabric, I do recommend looking into plastic washers that you put in between the backing and the eyelet. This gives another layer of stability for the eyelet to grip onto so it doesn't rip out of the fabric. Also, if you don't like the way these look, you can sew these on with the keyhole sewing machine. But anyways, now that the eyelets are in, we can move on to the next step. So grab both the top and bottom front panels. Using the pattern, locate the curved edge with the sewing guide. And this is where we're going to connect the two panels. So we're going to place the right sides together. Using the center as a guide, line up the two panels and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And it's very important to stitch at exactly a 1/4 inch seam allowance or the rest of the crown panels will not line up correctly. For the next step, we're going to be cleaning up that top edge and adding a top stitch. And I'm going to be using a double fold bias tape binder for a double needle sewing machine. But don't worry, you can also use this on a regular domestic machine. And that's what I'll show you right now. Start by replacing your needle with the twin needle. I'll have this needle linked in the description, and this needle works on all domestic machines. Switch your machine to zigzag stitch, your choice of length, and a 0 width. Thread your machine the same way, but add 2 spools of thread. Be sure to thread through both of the needles and add your binder. It's best to have the bias tape already in so you can line it up with the needles. And I found the easiest way to do this is just tape it down. And once you have it installed, give it a quick run to make sure all the stitches are looking good. Grab your front panels and place that seam directly in the center of the binder and stitch all the way through. And just like that, it's going to add a double top stitch on the front and cover the back seam. But if you want to ramp up production, I recommend getting a double needle sewing machine. This binder is a little bit more advanced than the one I used in the previous step, but they both get the job done. You can also mount both of the binders on any double needle sewing machine. And you use this one the same way. You place the seam directly in the center of the binder and stitch all the way through the seam. Since this panel has interfacing, it's a little bit trickier, so you may want to practice before using your good fabric. But when you pop that seam out, it's going to make the curve nice and round and look more professional. And another trick I found is using heavyweight thread. This is going to make those stitches pop out and look really nice. But anyways, the front panels are complete, so for the moment we can place them off to the side and grab both side panels and both back panels. Using the pattern, locate the sew to back and sew to side guide. This is the edge we're going to be attaching the back panel to the side panel. So place the right sides together, lining up the bottom edge. As you can see, the curve is not exactly the same, but it is the same exact length. So you're going to want to start the stitch at the bottom of the panel, sew through the curve, and move the two panels together as you sew. Just like with the front panels, we're going to be stitching at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And remember, you want to sew at exactly a 1/4 inch seam allowance so all these crown panels line up in the end. And no worries, if you don't think you've sewn it correctly, you can always de-thread and try again. But if you're ready, we're going to move on to the next step, and we're going to add double fold bias tape and top stitching to both of those new seams. These ones are a little bit easier since there's no interfacing, but it still could be tricky to get that stitch perfectly in the center of the seam. So like I said before, it's best to practice on scrap fabric before using your good fabric. You also want to wait to trim the bias tape that's sticking up past the panels until later steps. For the next step, we can place one of the side panel assemblies off to the side and grab the front panel assembly. Locate the remaining side on the side panel, and this is the edge we're going to be sewing to the front panel assembly. So place the right sides together, lining up the bottom edge, and we're going to sew it the same way we did as we sewed the side panel to the back panel. Start at the bottom edge and sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After sewing, pop out the front panels, take a look at it from the right side, and make sure everything is lined up. If everything is looking good, move back to the wrong side, trim the bias tape flush with the seam allowance, and then add double fold bias tape to the new seam. At this point, you can really start to see the crown of the cap coming together. Now we can grab the remaining side panel assembly, and we're going to attach it to the open edge. This one we're going to do a little bit differently because we're going to sew all the way through, starting at the front panel and ending at the back panel. Since it's not a perfect straight line, you're going to want to start at that side panel and front panel, sew to the center, kind of make a subtle curve, and then sew the back panel. And if everything was sewn correctly in previous steps, it should line up perfectly without any open edges. You also want to quickly double check it from the right side just to make sure all those side seams are coming in to the center point. If everything is looking good, we're going to flip the wrong sides out and trim the bias tape flush with the seam allowance. And just like how we sewed these panels together, we're going to add the bias tape in the same way. We're going to sew all the way through that entire edge. And by doing it this way, it's going to cover up all the raw bias tape in that center point area and give us a smooth bias tape ending at the back edge. So you should have no bias tape edges exposed on the inside of the cap. Moving on to the next step, we're going to be adding a side strip around the bottom edge of the crown. This gives us a little bit of structure to that bottom edge and also makes it way easier when we're installing the sweatband in later steps. And we're going to be lining it up directly with the bottom edge of the crown. Once you have it lined up, we're going to take it to the sewing machine and stitch directly in the center of the side strip. And as you can see, this holds the structure of the bottom edge and prevents the fabric from stretching when we install the sweatband. And now that we have the bottom edge sealed off, we can trim all the bias tape flush with the bottom edge. Next, we're going to move to the back opening and clean up the raw edge. There's a few different ways you can do this. You can roll the edge over and hem it, but I'm going to be adding double fold bias tape along that edge. I'm using a double fold bias tape binder on a single needle sewing machine, but you don't have to use an industrial sewing machine. You can also do this on a domestic sewing machine. You can also buy pre-made bias tape and stitch that directly to the edge. There's a lot of different ways you can add it, but I prefer the binder because it's a lot quicker if you're trying to ramp up production. The last thing we have to do to complete the crown is add the cover button, but I actually like to wait till the end to add that, so for the moment the crown is complete so we can place it off to the side. And grab all of your brim panels. I'm going to be using a pre-cut brim, but if you plan on cutting your own brim, you're going to use the outside edge of the brim panel. The best method for cutting these is using a clicker press with a die. But whether you're cutting yours or using your own shape brim, the next step, we're going to grab the two pieces of fabric, place the right sides together, trace the outside edge of the brim, and I like to extend it past about 1 inch, round out the corners, and then also add a center marking. Once the brim is fully marked, we can place it off to the side. Using the pattern, locate the fabric sew path, and this is where we're going to be placing our stitch. It's just under 1/4 inch on the inside of the curve, and then we're going to stitch all the way around the outside edge. It's very important to do the stitch all in one go because if you start and stop, it's going to create little edges, and once you flip the right sides out, you're going to see ripples and it's not going to sit well with the brim. From here, we're going to trim the outside edge 1/4 inch away from the stitch. You want to give yourself enough allowance so that way when you put the brim inside, you can fold that seam allowance under the brim. Flip the right sides out, push the curve out as much as possible, and press it down. We're trying to make that inside seam allowance as flat as possible. You may see a few ripples, but once you grab the brim and place it inside the sleeve, you're going to stretch it as far as you can towards that outside curve, and that should take care of any of the small wrinkles. This is why the stitch path is smaller than the actual size of the brim, so that way that sleeve can stretch around the brim and take care of any of the blemishes. Pull both sides of the fabric as tight as you can towards the bottom, place a pin, and then we're going to stitch the inside curved edge as close as we can to the brim. This is going to help set the fabric and keep it tight around the brim for when we add our top stitches. The top stitching is optional. If you don't want to add it, you can skip this step and keep the brim as is. But we're going to be adding them, and feel free to add as many as you want. I'm using an adjustable edge guide, and I'm going to keep pushing it in and adding a new stitch. And you could use any type of edge guide. It doesn't have to be an adjustable one. As long as you have the brim up against an edge, you're good to go. I was also using an industrial sewing machine. This is not necessary. I just had it set up already, so I decided to use it, but you can still do this on a domestic sewing machine. The last thing we need to do is cut off the excess fabric in the back, and I'm leaving about 1 inch of fabric because you want to give yourself enough room so you can attach it to the crown at the end of the project. You can cut it shorter or closer to that inside curve. I just found about 1 inch works perfectly. Real quick before we move on, if you're using a different shape brim, the steps are still the exact same. With the brim complete, we're going to grab the crown assembly, mark the center along the bottom edge, and also the center of the brim. Then we're going to place the right sides together, lining up the centers. From the center, move the crown along the edge of the brim, and that will be your start point. And you can move it in either direction to sew it, whatever you feel more comfortable with. The second way to do it is to start at the center and sew towards the outside edge in both directions. But since I found the start point, I'm going to start at one side of the brim and sew to the opposite side, attaching the crown to the brim. And you're trying to sew as close to the brim as possible. After sewing, you always want to double check to make sure the brim is still centered with the crown, because if it's offset, it's very noticeable and the hat's not going to fit right. The next step, we're going to grab our cord. I'm using a standard paracord. Feel free to switch it up. This is going to sit on the top side of the brim, so you want the piece to be long enough to go past the edges on the inside of the hat. Don't worry if it's a little bit long, we're going to snip these down in later steps. I found the best way to do this is to stitch one side and then you're going to pull it tight and stitch the opposite side. Because if it turns out too loose, the cord is going to be flapping around. Also, this is optional. If you don't like this look, you don't need to add the cord. I just find it's a fun little detail to add and it could really change up the look of the hat. Like I said before, wait to trim the ends of the cord because we still need them to be long. Moving on to adding the sweatband. This sweatband is bought at capsupplyco.com. It's a millinery grade sweatband. You can make these, but these are designed to put on the inside of a baseball cap and it's going to curve and fit nicely. The goal is to sew it along the bottom edge and that can be pretty tricky, so what you want to do is use a device. Luckily, you can make this out of cardstock paper. All you have to do is make a little sleeve that your sweatband slides into and it fits perfect to the same size as the sweatband. You don't want any wiggle room on the side edges. And you want this to be at least 5 to 7 inches long. Feed the sweatband through your new attachment and have about 2 inches hanging out. Line it up directly under the needle with the inside of the sweatband pointing up and the right side of the sweatband lined up with the needle, and then tape the attachment down. But before you start sewing, you're going to want to roll that edge over once, the exact same size as the size strip. Place the outside end over the needle and then just start sewing from there, and you're going to work all the way around over the brim and to the other side. It's very surprising how well this technique works because you get right up next to the brim and then you also get a top stitch on the outside, so you're essentially doing 2 steps in one. And that is the most complex part of making this style of hat. It's very easy to do and you can do it at home. But like always, if you do want to ramp up your production, you'll want to look into a post-bed sewing machine with a sweatband feeder. And that's what this is right here. It feeds the sweatband through the feeder, lines it up perfectly with the edge, and then you just follow it along the edge and stitch it down. With this step, you're not going to get the top stitch on the outside, so the sweatband will look like it's popping out just a little bit, but that will be fixed in later steps when we steam the hat because that will push that sweatband flat perfectly on the inside of the hat. But if you do want to add a top stitch, that's what you're going to do next. You're going to add a top stitch all the way around that bottom edge, but for this specific hat, I'm not going to add it. Now we can add the closure to the back, and there's a lot of different styles you can choose from. You can go leather, nylon, or plastic. They all do the same thing, so it really comes down to what style you like best. And to add them, it's really simple. All you have to do is fold the remaining part of the sweatband in half and then tuck it under the back opening. Make sure the sweatband is lined up with the back opening. Then we're going to take the back closure and slide it in between the sweatband and the bias tape. If you're using a plastic or nylon closure, you're going to do the same thing for the opposite side. But since I'm using a leather strap back, it's a little bit different. We're going to install the leather side the same exact way. Feed it in about a 1/2 inch and make sure it's parallel with the bottom edge. Once you have it lined up, stitch it down, and for the opposite side, we're just going to roll the sweatband over and stitch it down without anything in between the layers. For this step, it can be pretty bulky, so I do recommend using a heavyweight needle. You also want to double check the strap after sewing to make sure it's lined up with the bottom edge, or else it can be offset. Now that we have the strap in place, we're going to grab the buckle and install it on the opposite side. Before we install it, we want to lay the hat down flat, slide the strap over to the opposite side, and see where it lines up. You want to find the correct spot so the strap isn't sitting crooked on the back. And the buckle is super easy to install because it's secured down with an eyelet. So just like in previous steps, we're going to punch our hole and we're punching through the sweatband as well. Feed the eyelet through the opening so the right side of the eyelet is on the sweatband side of the cap. Locate the opening on the buckle and place the eyelet through the opening. I used a hammer die in previous steps, but for this step, I'm going to be using a die press. But either method works good. All you have to do is press that eyelet down and you're good to go. Feed the leather strap through the buckle and your back opening is complete. Now this buckle set does come with an oval eyelet that you can feed the strap into to hide it. It's going to be installed the same way as the eyelets we installed in the beginning with the outside and the backing. And you're going to want to place it in line with the strap directly after the buckle. But remember, for this one, we're only going through the hat material and not the sweatband. Because when you feed that strap into the oval eyelet, you want it to be behind the fabric and also in front of the sweatband. But I like the look of the full strap, so I'm going to leave the hat as is. Now that everything is complete, we're going to add the cover button, and this is a 3-prong cover button specially designed for caps. We'll be placing it directly in the top center of the crown. There's a few different ways to add the buttons, and I went over these in previous videos, but what you want to do is cut a circle out of your fabric to the size button you're using, the fabric around the outside of the cover button. To make this step easier, you can use a cover button tool. These come in most cover button sets. You place the fabric on top and push the cover button into the opening. This will wrap the fabric around the outside evenly. From here, you can grab the centerpiece of the cover button and place it in the opening of the top section. It may take a little bit of force depending on the thickness of your fabric. This is also going to tighten up that fabric and get rid of any wrinkles. Lastly, place the prong through the hat from the inside and hammer the button down. That method works great and I show how to do it in other videos, but for this one, I'm going to be using a die set. It's essentially the same thing. We're going to place the fabric on the die and push the top of the cover button into the opening. Feed the centerpiece into the opposite side of the die, bring the two die pieces together and hammer it down. It's going to yield the same results, but for this one, you can put it on a press and do this step very quickly. If you plan on making a lot of caps, this is a good way to go. Next, I'm going to show you how to level up from using a hammer like I did in previous videos. I'll be using a die press that has a button holder and a prong holder. So what I'm going to do is place that prong section into the prong holder on the die, place the complete cover button on the opposite side, line the hat up directly in the center and press it down. And if you're using this method, you don't need a lot of force or else you're going to bend the cover button. But whatever method you choose, they both work great because it's going to lock all those layers together at the center and overall make for a more quality hat. Before we get into the final step, I quickly added extra branding. I used leather tabs added with double-sided rivets and I only installed one on the side. If you didn't add embroidery in previous steps, this is the time to add your branding. And one of the biggest steps to get a professional finish is steaming the hat. I'm going to be using a hat block and a steamer, and what you do is place your hat on the hat block so it's nice and tight and then steam all the way around the sweatband and the seams. With the tightness around the block and the hotness of the steam, it's going to push everything into position and really clean up all the imperfections. And as you can see, when I take the hat block off, that sweatband on the inside is nice pushed up tight to the inside edge of the bottom crown. If you do choose to do this step, I recommend tightening the hat as tight as possible, placing it on a hat block or something that is the shape of a hat and then steaming. And this step is not mandatory. If you just wear the hat enough over time, it will press that sweatband up, but this is just a quick way to get it to that point if you plan on selling them. But other than that, the cap is complete, and a fun thing to do is try out different brims because a brim shape really does add a different level of style to the cap. This is a short brim I used from capsupplyco.com. It adds a whole different feel and look to the cap. It's just another way you can customize it to really make something unique to your style. And if you have any questions about the manufacturing process or any of the steps that we went over, feel free to reach out at properfitclothing.com and I'll get back to you. And there you have it, your 6-panel triangle cap is complete. Hopefully yours turned out as good as mine did. And when it comes to hats, practice really does make them perfect. There's a lot of little things that can go wrong, like the seam allowance, not setting the brim right, installing the sweatband too low so the hat turns out too tall. All these things can add up and make for a bad hat. But as long as you keep trying and don't give up, you'll eventually get a really good one. Like always, I want to see what you come up with, so tag me on Instagram at Properfit Clothing, and until then, I'm going to keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.